Hi, this is a re-examination of the Apollo moon landings, 1969 to 1972, based on conversations I've had over the years with many of the Apollo moonwalkers, mission controllers and other members of the Apollo team. So let's make a start. This is the entire program from Apollo 7 through to Apollo 17. As you probably know, there should have been 3 more Apollo missions, 18, 19 and 20. They were cancelled, but the Apollo capsule did fly again later in the form of the Apollo-Soyuz joint mission and also the Skylab missions, which of course didn't leave Earth orbit. And for many, many years, from when I was a pilot in the Navy right the way through until I became a science teacher and head of environmental science at a big high school, I've always been a massive fan of American astronautics and the Russians as well. And to be honest, that was the reason I joined the Navy as a pilot, because I wanted to be an astronaut. I realised quite quickly I was too young and 3,000 miles too far away from the centre of activity. Anyway, I've been lucky enough through my career after I left teaching. I sell meteorites for a living and also give lectures about them. I've also sold flown in space hardware, which has been a great opportunity to meet many of the Apollo astronauts. As you can see here, all of these guys are Apollo astronauts, apart from Malcolm Scott Carpenter here, who's a Mercury astronaut, the second American to orbit the Earth. He's the only Mercury astronaut I've actually been lucky enough to meet, but all the others here are all, you might recognize Buzz Aldrin, Gene Cernan, Charlie Duke, Alan Bean, and so it goes. Dave Scott, Al Worden, Fred Hayes, Tom Stafford, Jim Lovell, of course. So I've been very lucky to spend time with them and also with mission controllers. At one time, I used to give talks about the Apollo missions for many years, actually. This is me lecturing at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge, dismissing the so-called Apollo moon landing conspiracies because until a fateful meeting with Charlie Duke, as a matter of fact, I was a very keen advocate of it, but I still think the American space program is a wonderful thing, a wonderful achievement. A space shuttle, for example, I think the most incredible machines ever put together by mankind. But on an occasion, I was enjoying a social evening with Charlie Duke. I think it was the Apollo 16 moonwalker. He surprised me by suddenly saying that you can't see stars. Not only could you not see them from the moon, which I'd heard Neil Armstrong say on the sky at night back in 1969, actually. But he also said you can't see stars in cislunar space, which really surprised me, not the least because, as this quote here reveals, the Apollo astronauts used star sights with a sextant for navigation. You may remember on the Apollo 13 mission, famously, Lovell complained that he couldn't get a star sight because of the debris cloud that the spacecraft was traveling through. And as an amateur astronomer, which I have been since the age of 6 or 7, funny enough, I'm perfectly well aware that no matter how bright the streetlights, however bright the moon is in the sky, etc., once the sun set, you can see stars, particularly in rural Norfolk where I live. On this particular photo here is the moon, and it's a last quarter moon, and it's just occulted the star Aldebaran. And I took a photograph of this with a normal DSLR, standing in my front garden with security lights, house lights next door and so on. It didn't stop me seeing and capturing the image. Yet we're supposed to believe that wasn't possible for the Apollo astronauts. This is what I took literally a week ago. I was waiting to photograph the X-37B, so-called secret spy plane, but everyone knows all about it, which would have passed to the south there. But as I waited for it, I took this photograph just to get the focus right. And even with a very short exposure, which you can tell by the fact the stars are not trailed very much, look how many stars you can see, even though there's still plenty of twilight in the sky. And again, security lights and house lights, etc., etc. Here's a another very compelling photograph. It's taken from inside a brightly lit airliner, approaching the brightly lit city of Reykjavik, Iceland, and you've got the Aurora Borealis, and yet look at all the stars. At that height, at that altitude, and of course, particularly above Iceland, the skies are very clear, obviously, but even so, not as clear as the skies above the moon. And on several occasions, I met Dr. Ingham Mitchell, charming, very, very intelligent and personable man. Sadly, like many of the Apollo astronauts, is no longer with us. But I asked him about this, and he said it's ridiculous. You know, he actually was critical of Neil Armstrong. He said, no, the stars are so bright that when you walk on the moon, it's hard to focus on anything else. He said you could see really dim stars down to magnitude 8 or 9. He said, not only that, the M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, you know, you can't cover it with your hand. That's how bright the stars are, how good the seeing is. Well, whether he was on the moon or not, he obviously didn't want me to think for a minute that you couldn't see. You can see this video online. You can watch it online. It's a press conference soon after the Apollo 11 crew left quarantine. And wouldn't you think they'd be excited, enthusiastic? Wouldn't you think they'd be keen to put the story out there? But they're not. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm not going to dwell on the sound. But look at Neil Armstrong's face. He looks really uncomfortable. I know we're told that he was quite quite a quiet, modest man in many ways. But again, look at Aldrin on the left and Michael Collins on the right. They're not looking at the guy. I showed this video to a friend who's a psychologist without saying who they were and without the spacesuits, etc. He had no idea. He's not that interested in astronautics. And he said the guy in the middle is obviously the leader of this group of 3 men, and they dissociate themselves from his comments. In other words, he's saying things they know not to be true. They don't want to be associated. Look at Aldrin there, look. You know, and Michael Collins, they almost look ashamed. And if you watch the thing on YouTube or elsewhere, you'll find there's all kinds of little strange little verbal clues. Like we went to the moon in 1969, not blah, blah, blah. With that pause, it's fascinating to watch this. The last time I met Alan Bean, again, sadly he's dead. A charming man. He was a very keen artist. And most of what he wanted to talk about with his art was art. I actually was exhibiting some of my paintings at the time. You can see some of them behind me on the wall, actually. And I asked him to describe the descent phase because he hadn't mentioned much about the actual landings in his books. And he said, oh, it was silent. I said, sorry. He said, yeah, it's silent. You just kind of drift down to the surface, you know. And I said, well, surely it's, I mean, you've got 10,000 pounds of roaring rocket underneath you, and you're separated from it just by some tubular aluminium and some aluminium foil. And he didn't get. He's not the sort of guy to get angry, but he became quite animated. Who went to the moon? You or me? And I said, well, yeah, you did, Captain Bean. Yeah, of course, he said. And I said to him, well, yeah, just that when I was in the Navy, I was lucky enough to fly in the back seat of get a couple of rides in Hawker Hunters, okay? And I said, they're deafening when you're inside. If you weren't wearing a bone dome and earphones, etc., you'd be quite uncomfortable. And he said, no, well, you're in a vacuum, it's different. So you're just drifting down in a vacuum, you can't hear a thing. Well, I thought, the science doesn't stack up there at all. As it happened, I was sat in between, well, there was Alan Bean himself, then Linda, my wife, and then Gene Cernan at the same table. And so we swapped places, and a bit later I asked Captain Cernan the same question, and his response was completely and utterly different. He looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, well, it's like, you're just about hanging in there. He said, you know, you look calm outwardly, but, you know, the noise and the vibration, he said, it's tremendous. It's like being in an oil drum with people beating the outsides with baseball bats. They can't both be saying the same thing. I mean, when you look at it, up here, you have the crew compartment, That's the ascent engine. It's going to take them back up to orbit to rendezvous with the command and service module. But here we have the descent stage with the descent motor. Admittedly, it did throttle down shortly before it landed, but all the way down, more or less, it was 10,000 pounds of thrust. And there's literally, in between the top of the descent stage and the bottom of the ascent stage, there's literally just a bit of tubing and aluminium foil so thin that when they were during construction, occasionally workers in the early part of the program would drop in screwdrivers or spanners and then go straight through the floor. And so these rubber tiles were used to coat the floor to stop that happening. I used to sell these. You remember I mentioned just now I used to sell space memorabilia, and these were a very popular thing. And that's what they were for, because it was such a frequent occurrence that they would drop screwdrivers and they go straight through the thin aluminium. You're supposed to believe that that 10,000 pound thrust, the vibration, if you've watched and seen videos of, like for example, First Man or Apollo 13, you know that during the launch of the rockets, admittedly, Saturn's a very powerful rocket, but you'll notice, or even during the S4B stage, when that lights up, you'll notice they should depict tremendous vibration and noise inside the crew compartment. Yet they were only separated literally by thin aluminium, that's all. I was recently asked to be on a TV program, and it was actually one of the morning shows, and my inclination was to accept, because it'd be quite nice to meet Holly Willoughby, wouldn't it? But I asked the researcher who phoned me what the questions were likely to be and what the slight the angle of the program would be, and I wasn't happy with their answers. So in the end, I decided I wasn't going to be up there to be ridiculed. There wasn't going to be, the slot was so short, there was obviously going to be no chance for a proper reasoned argument. So I declined. So they had a pretty well-known female astronomer on there, and she answered the questions from viewers. And honestly, I've never heard such a load of poppycock in my life. I mean, to be fair to the lady, an astronomer is an astronomer. Although I've got a degree, most large element of which was astronomy, I'm a meteoricist, and my knowledge of the Apollo programs comes from being interested in astronautics since I was a little boy. I mean, I was born in 1951. So in 1957, when the first Sputnik went up, I was 6, and when Gagarin, Shepard, Christian went up in 61, I was 10. So obviously, my enthusiasm goes back a long way. So this astronomer probably quite obviously knew nothing at all about space travel. When somebody asked her why there was no crater in the photographs of Apollo 11 landing site, she said, oh, they landed on a flat, dusk-free rock, so no crater was made. Okay, well, here's a photograph. If there's no dust, how come there's all these footprints underneath the LM or all around the LM? And it also begs the question, although the motor had throttled down, and as you'll see in a second, you'd still expect it to have blown the dust away if it had landed as we're told. This astronomer also said that the descent motor wasn't very powerful. I think 10,000 pounds of thrust is very powerful. And it was turned off well above the surface to allow the LM to drift down. No, it wasn't. It was throttled back, I think, to as low as 40% for the last phase of the descent. But the first words spoken on the moon, if you bother to listen to the transcript or read the transcript or listen to it, will be Buzz Aldrin saying, contact light, okay, engine stop, by which he means when the thing actually reaches the lunar surface, these contact arms here, when one of those touches the surface of the moon, it triggers a light inside the crew compartment, and then the engine is manually turned off. And so the engine is still running right until the last meter of flight when these contact arms actually touch the surface. So she just wasn't telling the truth at all. Either she didn't know the truth or she was just avoiding an inconvenient truth. I'm not going to rehearse all of these because I think many people have covered this in other talks and so on. But as I say here, it's incredible that nearly 6,000 photographs were taken on the moon with such astonishing results. Now, this one here, is obviously taken from one of the later missions. I can't make out the name of the astronaut, because you'll see that both of the astronauts have cameras on their chest. In the case of Apollo 11, there was only one camera used, Stills camera used, Hasselblad Stills camera, which to some extent explains why there are no pictures of Neil Armstrong on it. But look at this picture, how beautifully framed it is. The horizon line behind the astronaut passes through and exactly matches up with the horizon line in the reflection. What an astonishing thing to achieve. Particularly, I had a dialogue with one of the engineers at Hasselblad when I was writing one of my books. And he said, okay, yeah, the camera had been modified so that settings could be more easily made using large levers and so on and so forth. So the camera had no viewfinder, like no conventional viewfinder, but it's just a simple sighting ring. So given that, how incredible this picture, and the fact that the other 6,000, vast majority of them were superbly taken. I once had a dialogue before he passed away with Dr. Brian O'Leary. He would have been one of the science astronauts. He was one of the science astronauts in the program. It's often the subject of disappointment. The only scientist who ever went to the moon was Harrison Schmitt on Apollo 17. He was a geologist. Because the others were all fantastic pilots, test pilots. So many of them had engineering qualifications. But the only scientist chosen as a scientist went to him was Harrison Schmitt. Well, Brian O'Leary, I asked him about some of the photographs, and he actually gave me this quote, which he obviously gave other people, because I've seen it since in books and online. In an email, he said to me, some of the films, some of the photos were spoiled. It's possible, by which of course he means certain, that NASA will have shot some scenes in a studio to avoid embarrassment. But what he means by embarrassment is, even before Apollo 11 flew, there was a public outcry about in various quarters, about the amount of money, 23 billion or so, spent on the mission, on the program. Couldn't that be, and that and the war in Vietnam, were sort of in the public eye coupled together as a waste of money that could have been spent on housing and education and so on and so forth. But then he also pointed out to me, he said, if you want to do a really interesting piece of mathematics, he said, just add up the amount of time they were on the moon walking about and compare that to the amount of photographs they took. Well, if you do that simple calculation, you find that the amount of time the astronauts spent on EVA was outside the spacecraft was just under 5,000 minutes. The total number of photos they took was nearly 6,000 photos. Now, if you work that out, that works out to a photograph every 50 seconds. Now, they've got to sleep, they've got to eat, they weren't sent there to take photos, they were sent there to do experiments, okay, and collect rocks. They've got to collect rocks, they've got to label them, they've got to pack them, transfer them into the LM, they've had to assemble the lunar rover, had to travel because they didn't take any photographs when they were in transit on the rover. The rover moved quite slowly, so they spent a lot of time on board it without taking photographs. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Even if they took a photograph every waking second they were on the moon, and had to have taken a picture every 50 seconds, which they didn't. They just patently didn't. And as I got more and more interested in looking at this, or puzzled, perplexed, I started looking at the photographic record published on the NASA website at the time. I mean, I have to say, since then, there's been some changes made to it, but I'm talking back in very early days. You have to recall that in 1969 through 72, a number of normal people like you and me who had computers, decent computers, PCs, and software to go with it, particularly image handling software, very, very few. I didn't have my first computer until 1998, even though I was head of in charge of computer technology at school at the time. And it was pretty crummy. I mean, I remember putting Publisher on there, and to put Publisher on, I had to take off some other software because just didn't have the capacity. And again, in those days, computers just didn't have the memory either for long processes like photographic handling, and the software just didn't exist. I think NASA thought it could get away with it because they knew nobody would be able to look at the photos critically and analytically. But I actually, as soon as I had the chance and a decent dial-up, I began to download the photographs, and over the years I've examined them. This is a famous one. Look at this mountain here in the background with the Apollo astronaut wandering across. And it seemed to have a sort of ring a bell with me. And I then remember the photograph I'd seen. This is really one of a whole series of the Apollo astronauts doing the geology training on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the same mountain, which is strange because this is a volcanic parasitic cone or subcone. And we're told there's no visible recent volcanic activity on the moon. Okay, but even stranger, this is in the opening scene of the Kubrick film 2001, and again you've got this very familiar upturned boat shape in the background here. And if you enhance it, you can also see these little mountains that were on the left of the other picture. So it's almost as if Kubrick is telling us something when he made this film. Perhaps he was. We'll see in a minute. This is the original photo on the NASA website, the NASA catalogue, and the moon in the foreground, and that's alleged to be the sun. Again, I'm sure that NASA didn't think people would have image handling software that could do this, that reduce the gamma and increase the darkness of the thing. But if you look, I mean, this is quite obviously, this object is quite obviously an arc light. There's been a lot made about secondary sources of illumination. I won't go down that because I think there's a lot of nonsense been spoken about the angles of the shadows and so on and so forth. But there's plenty of evidence that secondary lighting was used in those, or more than one source of illumination occurs in the Apollo photograph catalogue. But of course, the record states that the only source of illumination on the moon was the sun and the Earth. But there we are. Here's a fascinating photograph. I actually found this myself, but other researchers or interested parties have picked it out too. Here we have Harrison Schmitt being photographed, as you can probably tell, slightly from above, from higher. Bearing in mind, don't forget the cameras, as you can see, are on the chest of the photographer. Okay, so for this photograph to be taken, Gene Cernan, the photographer, must have been quite a bit higher than Harrison Schmitt. And Schmitt is setting up an experiment here next to this large rock. But as I noticed, when you zoom in on it, as I habitually did, you'll notice there's something going on here. What's this here? When you enlarge it, it's obviously another person in a spacesuit. It can't possibly be Cernan, because Cernan, is the person taking the photograph, so it can't be reflected in it. He's 180 degrees away from. What's even stranger, there's something missing. You look here and here, you can see that on the moon, the astronauts they had to use a PLSSS, personal life support system, and you can see in there the reason for that. If you are out in the full glare of the sun, you're up in several hundred degrees centigrade. If you walk behind a rock in the shadow, there's no conduction or convection. And once you're out, they'll say the sun's radiation, it drops down to below minus 200. So you've got a 500 degree temperature differential. So you need this thing. It's got, apart from providing you with oxygen and water, etc., the thing is also cooling and heating your suit instantly as required. Here's another photograph, very famous one. This is the Surveyor spacecraft. This is the Apollo 12 lunar module. There's a funny thing about the Apollo 12 mission. Almost the first thing that Alan Bean did when he walked down the step, he was supposed to make some kind of adjustments to the lunar surface video camera, because there's been a lot of criticism about the poor quality of the video on the Apollo 11 mission. And so Bean, obviously was under some pressure to get decent video. You'd have thought, what's the first thing he did? Point the camera at the sun, and you can actually see that online. You can find the actual piece of video when he does it. And burn out the sensor in the camera. So there's no live video on Apollo 12. Most strange, or some might say most convenient. But I noticed one of these things in the background here. Again, messing around, fiddling about the contrast and the beta and gamma on my Paint Shop Pro. You can see there are two definite objects. This one, I think, looks a bit like another lunar module, which is strange. It's obviously been. What's this other thing here? That again has a sort of familiar look to it, and I think it bears a very striking resemblance to a two-boom or two-hoist military tow truck, which is widely used by NASA throughout the 60s and 70s. How did that get on the moon? And then we'll just keep moving through some of these photos. You can do this yourself. Plenty of the photos are still in the catalogue, although I have to tell you, some of them have been removed. This is an iconic, famous photograph of Harrison Schmitt heroically standing there holding the flag. You've got a mountain in the background here, presumably. And there you have the moon, the Earth above, you know, iconic shot, except that if you, again, you alter the settings, you find that it's a cut and paste job. And Schmitt has been pasted in here. The flag and the Earth form the original background, presumably, but I can't believe they were taken on the moon. For an obvious reason. One of the things the Apollo astronauts were worried about, or were quite scared of, was falling over, particularly on the earlier missions. I know this is on 17. Yet this photograph can only have been taken, bear in mind the cameras are on the shoe, on the astronaut's chest. This can only have been taken, if Cernan took it, with him sat on the ground or kneeling right down, pointing upwards to get that perspective, which again, you know, it just doesn't seem feasible to me. That they would do that, had better things to do. Famous one on Apollo 16, I've actually spoken about this to a camera engineer, and he says the Hasselblad they use on the moon, it's impossible to take a double exposure, yet we have here a wall, a light coloured wall with a doorway through it of some sort. You can see the edge of the door there, and you know, it's superimposed over allegedly a view of the moon's surface. Again, it's just not feasible. As originally published, this photograph of Dr. Mitchell on the moon shows him brightly lit, even though this side of his spacesuit is in the shadow, which you can tell by the fact the source for illumination, the sun is over here, casting this curious shadow down here. He's still brightly lit here. Again, it's that's the original. It seemed a bit strange, and quite soon people began to comment on this particular photo, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the version that you can see now is different. It's been altered. Now this side is in much more shadow, and the dark shadow is much denser, thicker, and more credible than the strange little shadow here. It makes him look like a Stiltman. There's actually, and the shadows everywhere else have been. Here's a strange one. Now, remember what I said about they usually had two cameras on the moon. Well, here you can see a pair of photographs. They're just separated by 3 exposures in the Apollo 15 catalogue. And you can see this photograph here of Dave Scott, the mission commander, was taken by Jim Irwin. And you can see Scott has got a camera on his chest. Okay, that's fine and dandy. And therefore, Irwin must have had a camera on his chest too to have taken the picture. And yet, 2 exposures later, we see this photograph allegedly of Irwin taken by Scott, and there's no camera. You know, so how did Jim Irwin, if he didn't have a photograph, how did he photograph Dave Scott? It's just, again, it's the devil's in the detail, and either some whistleblower at NASA had this photograph published as a heads up to the rest of us, or it was just a mistake that was made during the production of these images. Again, you look at this one here, and I know that there's no aerial perspective on the moon because there's no atmosphere, but quite obviously looking at the size and relative angles of these little sub-mountains here, this major mountain, it's the same background. And yet here we have the lunar module, close to us, and here we have the lunar module right off in the distance and an astronaut close to us setting up an experiment. That's the same crater in both cases. So, you know, who moved the LM? They've got a background, they use it regardless, and somebody just has got it wrong. You know, there we are. This is the moon boot used by all the Apollo moonwalkers, and you can see it has these parallel cleats in the bottom, which leave a characteristic footprint. And yet in this particular shot here, I forget which mission this is from, but you can find it online. It's part of a much larger photograph. You can see there's an entirely different shape, tread pattern, entirely different. So who made it? You know, if you were a believer in the idea that possibly not all the photographs, if any, were taken on the moon, you might think it was one of the technicians setting up the shot. But anyway, that footprint was not made by the standard Apollo EVA boot. And another feature is what appear to be stage lines. Is as if you've got a backdrop here, then a demarcation, then another backdrop here, leading forward, then possibly. It's as if you've got, you know, looking from the side, you've got a vertical backdrop, then an angle one, then an angle one, then an angle, to give a gradual blend down to the foreground, which you would see if it were taken in a studio. Again, funny enough, I watched the film First Man last night and paused it occasionally, and you do actually get this feature in the in that film, in the sections where you see Armstrong walking on the moon and thinking about his poor little daughter. You could see some obvious examples of stage lines there, but you shouldn't get them in genuine photographs taken on the moon, should you? And again, the number of times when you look at videos or images of the lunar rover, which was used in the last few missions on the Apollo program, I mean, they didn't. If the thing only travelled between 5 and 7 kilometres an hour, so they didn't really get a lot of benefit from it. But you know, we're told it was. This is obviously one of the early ones, possibly 15, because there's the later one had this a kind of blue collecting box here. Okay, but the strange thing is, lots of footprints, but look, there are absolutely no tyre tracks. So how did the thing get there? Was it, you know, it's almost as if it were lowered down from above. Possibly it was. And that's not the only case. There are plenty of shots that have exactly the same situation. Here, you have what appears to be the lunar is still packed on its pallet, yet in the foreground there are rover tracks. But in whichever case, I mean, there are when the rover was deployed, the tracks are all over the place, but very rarely underneath it. Now, this guy here, John Young, was one of my all-time great heroes. Okay, and he always said he would never write. It was Apollo 16 commander. He would never write a biography, an autobiography, or agree to do public appearances and so on and so forth until such time as he'd retired from the armed forces and from NASA. When he did finally, he collaborated with James Hansen, who's also the guy who wrote First Man, and he wrote his account, and everyone was looking forward to it immensely. But then when you start to read it, all kinds of strange. For example, in the book, he's addressing the fact that he was one of the members of the Apollo 10 crew that descended close to the surface of the moon and then returned back up to lunar orbit without landing. And when he was asked, you know, did you not feel kind of frustrated by that? Did you not think? And he said, well, you know, we were okay because the Apollo 10 couldn't land on the moon anyway because it had no landing gear, except that it did. You know, the Apollo 10 command, service, and lunar modules were exactly exactly the same as if they were going to attempt a complete landing. They had to. It was a full dry run for the Apollo 11 mission, which followed. So it's just not true. They extended the legs after the LM was pulled out, you know, from the S4B stage, etc., etc. It's just not true to say that it didn't have landing. It did. And then at one point he's talking about the Apollo 13 disaster, and he claims that he was looking over Cy Liebegot's shoulder, and he claims to have been the first person to notice that the telemetry was going haywire. Except that Cy Liebegot, who's the EECOM on Apollo 13, among others, has an entirely different. He said that Young was nowhere near. He wasn't in the room. So the only astronauts in the room were Capcom, the capsule communicator, which it was by tradition was an astronaut, member of the astronaut corps. And he said he wouldn't have been looking over his shoulder. He wouldn't have been allowed to. He said, I wouldn't have allowed him looking over my shoulder. I'm busy doing my job. He said, in any case, he wouldn't have been able to interpret the data whatsoever. It's a constant stream of telemetry. And he said it's just nonsense. He wasn't the first person because he wasn't there. And then again, at one point, there's a discussion between Ken Mattingly and Young, and Mattingly's in the command module in lunar orbit, and Charlie Duke and John Young, and you hear John Young say, "Can you see? Oh, yeah, I can see the leg." He said, we were so relieved when we heard that all 3 legs of the lunar module had extended. 3 legs. I mean, even 10-year-old kids know the lunar module had 4 legs, but that's how he remembers it. STS-107 was the final mission of Columbia, which, as everybody knows, sadly burned up on re-entry because it had a piece of insulating foam from the external fuel tank had hit the leading edge of Columbia's wing, knocking off a piece of the carbon protective system. It certainly didn't dock with the ISS at any point. If it had done, I think somebody might have noticed that the thermal protection had been compromised. And again, why? How would somebody like Young get that wrong? He was the guy, don't forget, who flew the first ever shuttle mission. Strange. It's either you could either say maybe John Young at this stage is going to some kind of Alzheimer's, or he's a memory lapse, which James Hansen assures us he wasn't. Or was he perhaps trying to, at this late stage in his career and life, trying to flag the fact that all was not as recorded by history? You don't know. It's possible, in a kind of a last little burst of, shame or embarrassment or whatever. There we are. This is a familiar image of the Apollo 13 service module in space after it's separated from the command module for the return to Earth. And we're in the film Apollo 13, and at the time we're led to look at this area here. The whole panel has disappeared, been blown off the surface of the service module by the explosion of the cryo tank inside, except that panel was always routinely removed on all the missions. The amount of heat the command and service module received while they're in space was considerable. And so they did what they called, I think they called it a barbecue maneuver, where they would rotate the thing around its longitudinal axis. And that panel would be removed by use of explosive bolts to allow venting from inside and to allow the inside to be cooled as well by rotating it. That's the Apollo 15 CSMs, and there's the Apollo 17 one. So again, the same panel removed. So this, the incredible damage that you'd expect from an exploding cryogenic tank, full of oxygen, just doesn't seem to be there. And here we have the 2 different canisters, lithium hydroxide canisters, that, according to the film Apollo 13, played a central role in the whole disaster. The cylindrical one that was inside the inside the command module, and the square ones which were in the lunar module. And you can see one here in situ. Okay, now this here has been rigged. You can see. Sorry, that's the wrong way around. We're told that For those of you who are not familiar with the whole Apollo 13 story, it always to me seemed far too good to be true. Okay, and looking back at that, the problem being, of course, that after the explosion, they lost a lot of their oxygen. The explosion was, we're told, caused by an electrical spark by a stirring motor to stir the liquid oxygen in a cryogenic storage tank. And so they had the problem. They'd lost a considerable amount of their oxygen, so they had no choice. They had to shut down the command module and go through into the descent, the lunar module, the three of them, for most of the journey back to Earth, using the oxygen available inside the lunar module. And they had all kinds of problems because the lunar module was only really designed for 2 men for, I don't know, a maximum of 72 or so hours, 80 hours, for the time that would have been spent on the lunar surface. And of course, it wasn't so much the oxygen that they managed to eke that out, but as the film shows, but it was the fact that 3 men were producing carbon dioxide in excess of what the lithium hydroxide scrubber inside the lunar module was capable of dealing with. So the partial pressure rose and are gradually in danger of being suffocated by it. And so we're told that Ken Mattingly, who, there's another strange thing about the mission. Mattingly was scheduled to be the command module pilot of Apollo 13, but at the last minute, Deke Slayton, head of the astronaut office, calls Lovell in and says, okay, with washing Mattingly, he can't go. And why not? Because his children have been playing with Charlie Duke's children who may have chicken pox. And so Mattingly may have chicken pox, and Mattingly is I've had chicken pox, and so the rest of the 13, Lovell and Hayes, we've had chicken pox, but no, you're not taking him. You're having Jack Swigert instead. And the high point of the film is where Mattingly solves the thing heroically. With the SimSoup team, they work out using bits of folder covers and tubing and bits of stuff from the EVA suits and so on to construct a mechanism whereby they can use the square canisters from the command module, which they've got spares of, to replace the round ones when they get saturated. I mean, even for my limited amount of time in the services, I'll tell you have this built-in redundancy in military equipment, which is, take for example, in NATO, the long arms, rifles and SMGs and so on and so forth, use the same ammunition throughout NATO as do the sidearms. I mean, it would be silly if they didn't. If supposing the standard sidearm of the British Army was a 38 and the standard sidearm in the American and Germans was 45, okay, it would mean if you were in combat, with other members of NATO, and you ran out of ammunition, you're stuck. You couldn't use theirs. It just doesn't make any sense. It just isn't done that way. Yet you're supposed to believe, as I said before, that the two contractors, the one who built the command module and the ones who built the lunar module, used entirely different lithium hydroxide canisters. It just doesn't make sense. They designed it around one system, I would have thought. And you can see they had loads and loads and loads of spare lithium hydroxide canisters on one of the pallets attached to the lunar module. I wouldn't have thought it was beyond the wit of man to have gone outside and done an EVA and brought some of those in, and and obviate the need for Ken Mattingly to come up with his clever fix. Okay. Another thing, at one of the meetings I attended, it was actually Al Worden, the Apollo 15 command module pilot, and Tom Stafford, okay, went to the moon on Apollo 10. Obviously didn't that, and he was a commander of the Apollo 10 mission. A friend of mine was there who's always been a bit cynical about the Apollo landings, put his hand up to ask a question, and his question was, it's interesting that Chris Kraft, who's the senior flight director, in his book Flight, states categorically that the Apollo missions couldn't possibly have done a direct straight in approach, because they got far too much kinetic energy to burn off, 26,000 miles an hour. They would have just burned up. Or if they got it slightly wrong angle, skipped off into space. So what they did what's called a skip re-entry. They came in from the moon and curved back out again, okay, into beyond the Earth, well beyond the Earth, and did what's called a ballistic coast, okay, to burn off some more fuel with the Earth's gravity pulling back on them. Okay, so they're coming in, they burn off some energy, kinetic energy through friction, then they burn off some more energy during this ballistic coast, and then when they're slow enough, they glide down for re-entry to the landing site, and that's what Chris Kraft says in his book, Flight. And when it was pointed out to Al Worden and Tom Stafford that neither of those say that, in both of their autobiographies, they claim that they did a direct straight in entry, hot re-entry. And, that's Tom Stafford, and there's Al Worden. And, Al Worden got really, really quite angry, quite animated. And his reply was, Chris Kraft is a bad guy. If we could feed him to a bomb, we would. What? Because the guy who, in a sense, was your boss at the time, because the guy's got a different perspective or memory of how this re-entry, why would you be that rude about it or so dismissive? And wouldn't you think the senior flight director would know perfectly well what trajectory was used? So it's this, again, the devil's in the details, this difference, total difference in memory or recollection. Now here, some of you may know what these are, just outside Bedford at a place called Cardington. There's these enormous hangars where some giant airships, I think, including the R101, certainly the R100, were built. They're vast. These are cars down here. These things are like the VAB at Cape Canaveral on its side. They're really huge. One of them now is, I believe, used for testing by the Health and Safety Executive. They test flammable materials. But the other one has had a variety of uses, okay, and it has in the past been rented out, as we'll see in a minute. And I should say that some years ago, I was doing a talk at a local astronomy society, a big one, well-known astronomical society. And it was given in a big school, big public school. And at the interval, I was talking about lunar meteorites, okay, which is a bit of a speciality of mine at the time, still is to an extent. And I was comparing them with the chemistry of the rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts. At the time, don't forget, I've always, as I said right at the start, for years I gave lectures about dismissing the Apollo conspiracy, so-called conspiracy, because I just, until I met the astronauts and began to have doubts about it. And that was kind of my take at this time here. And I mentioned about, I was talking about the rocks brought back. And at halftime, the senior lab tech came up and chatted. He said, before he worked at school, he'd worked at Cardington, okay, as a technician. And he said, I met Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and I looked in astonishment. I said, where did you meet them, at the Cape? He said, no, at Cardington. I said, well, I've no record. There's no record of being there. Oh yeah, they built a model of the lunar surface for them to train on. They were there for a while. And of course, there's no record of this at all. I said, are you sure? He said, yeah, I've got some photographs. I said, I'd love to see those, thinking, cool, would I? And he said, okay, next time you come in the autumn, I'll bring them. But the autumn came and he wasn't there, and nobody really knew where he'd gone or what had happened to him. But it is true that NASA did build training facilities. I mean, someone like, I believe that these are at Langley, which you can see here. It's an early attempt for them to learn how to use the descent phase using cranes and so on. But look at this one here. This again is at Langley. If this was removed, this crane, you would think this was a photograph and get rid of the guy here. You'd think this was a photograph taken on the moon. I mean, it's a slightly earlier version of the lunar module, but look at this very, very accurate lunar surface, or a lunar surface that very closely resembles the ones in the Apollo catalogue. And they even went to the extent of building two enormous globes, which are accurate down to 100 meters, I believe, the craters, using data from various lunar orbiters and Ranger and surveyor. It's got a track here, and this track, as many of you know, is a dolly track, and it's used to pan a camera around. And you could say that, you know, the NASA would say these photographs were not immediately available, they've only recently come onto the scene. They'd say these were taken in order to, or these globes were built in order to, astronauts could actually use a simulator, much in the same way that modern airline pilots are trained, believe it or not, on a simulator. Often don't even have an hour in a real plane before they start. The simulators are so good, so accurate, they can actually learn to fly. Though the idea is you could learn the insertion into lunar orbit and descent phase using a simulator, and it would be like a camera moving on a dolly around this. But, you know, a cynic might say there was another reason for building that, another reason for that simulation. Now, of course, I'm a meteoriticist. I make a living lecturing about, writing books about, and selling meteorites. Meteorites from our company, Space Rocks, is often used on the TV and so on and so forth. And so obviously I'm very interested in the lunar rocks, and have been right from the start, you know, and we're told that 380 kilos of rocks were brought back by the 6 Apollo landings, okay? And amazingly, at the time I wrote this, over 300 kilos have not been examined. They're still in the Lunar Receiving Lab, they're still in their bags and in metal containers. There's another curious thing, by the way, is that I spoke to Gene Cernan with another friend of mine. We were chatting to him. We asked him about how they got the rocks off the lunar surface and into the lunar module. And he looked at it and said, "What's the problem?" And my friend, he said, "Well, I've actually done it. So knowing how many rocks you collected on 17, we've got the little bags similar to your bags, your little cloth type bags, and the labels, and you weigh them, you write the label on them, you tie the label onto the bag, you put it in the metal canister. The canister is then passed up to the lunar module and put into a crate, a box with a lid. How did you get them out? Oh, well, we had this what was called a lunar conveyor system. You know, like it was like a pulley system. And my friend David said, "Well, I've done the experiment with the mathematics. You weren't on the moon long enough, 72 hours, to do that. Every rock you collected to be processed in that way and then sent up with this little." And then CERN looked a bit, you know, sort of flustered. He goes, "No, well, we didn't do that. We were supposed to look, between you and me, we didn't do that. We just Harrison stood in the doorway and I passed the rocks up to him." Yeah. Okay. So again, it's as if somebody's trying to come up with a plausible explanation for an apparent dichotomy in the story. Okay. I should also mention over 100 kilos of lunar meteorites have been recovered, and many of those are kept by NASA. Since the late 70s or mid to late 70s, all the ones from Antarctica, for example, are kept by NASA at the Lunar Receiving Lab. This is, so most of the meteorites are not in the public domain. You try and get hold of one, or you want to examine one, it's very difficult. Some of the talks I've given or that I've attended at Cambridge, for example, or other places, there's an organisation, I don't know what they're called now, but they were called PPARC, particle physics, and they would bring along a collection of samples of lunar material, dust and stuff, and God, they came in a sealed case, real palaver. So NASA don't let these things out of their hands, but they did, straight after the lunar missions, they did give out 270 so-called goodwill rocks. These are samples from the Apollo missions that were given to potentates and heads of state of various United Nations members around the world. This particular one is interesting because it was given to the Netherlands, and it's one of the few where people still know where it is. As I say here, 180 of the 270 have gone missing. We know where one went. When the Armagh Planetarium burnt down, the fireman went in there, raked out all the debris and carefully raked out the moon rock, which is inside a sealed container. It's somewhere underneath a pile of debris. So people on occasion, I believe, go to look for it. But the fascinating thing is that they haven't stood up to close examination. For example, this Apollo 14 moon rock was sent to be examined in Australia, and it was found to be a lump of granite, and it had characteristically terrestrial quartzites and zircons in it. And NASA's explanation was far from credible, or the professor at Curtin University, Nimchin, which is, and it must have been a rock blasted off the surface of the Earth by an impact, cometary or asteroidal impact on the Earth, that was blasted into space and landed on the moon. Now, the reverse thing does happen. There are, as I've mentioned before, probably around 300 lunar meteorites that have landed on Earth. That's pieces of the moon that were blasted off during the crater formation, presumably on the moon, and were captured by the Earth's gravity. Now, of course, the Earth's gravity is 6 times as strong as that of the moon, which is a problem in 2 directions, because anything blasted off the Earth's surface would be dragged back quite quickly. And there's no evidence that any rock in recent times, that's in the last, 2-3 billion years, has ever managed to leave the Earth's surface, because we've also got a thick atmosphere which would prevent that happening. And what would be the chances of a rare, even supposing a handful of lunar rock, for some reason, as a result of massive impacts, have actually managed to make it all the way to the moon without being dragged back by the Earth's gravity? What would be the chances that Apollo 14 happened to land near enough for Charlie Duke to find one? Not Charlie Duke, say Edgar Mitchell to find one, or Al Shep. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Not credible. It seems to me far more likely that image. But even stranger, that moon rock we saw before, the Goodwill moon rock, that went to Holland, has been found out when they removed it from its original case to redisplay it. They discovered the thing was a piece of petrified wood. Indisputably a piece of petrified wood. So, what's going on here? Even stranger, I used to often mention in my lectures that there were 3 minerals brought back from the Apollo missions that are unknown on Earth: pyroxoferrite, tranquilityite, obviously named after Tranquility Base, and armalcolite, which is named after Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. And those 3 were considered to be unique. NASA triumphantly used to say that these 3 minerals prove that why would you want to do that? But they say they prove that we actually went to the moon. Well, the sad part is all 3 have now been found to be relatively abundant. I mean, I've got quite a lot of tranquilityite. Sell it. But there we are. So even that piece of, you see, because the apologists for the lunar landings, this is one of the things they most commonly mention, and you can see it's not true. They also mention things like, the fact that laser beams are reflected laser beams from the Earth are reflected off the panel or laser mirror left on the moon by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. But what they don't mention is that people have been reflecting laser beams off the moon since 1957. It was first done during International Geophysical Year in 1957. The moon has such a high albedo that laser beams, I've done it with school kids. So basically the apologists rely on the fact that most people just don't know the whole truth, and they can't identify the sort of semi-truths and half-truths that NASA rely on to keep the story going. But why? Why fake it? That's the question. Well, I think it all goes back to 1960, 61, when America, John Kennedy does his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, and to commit America to sending a man to the moon before the end of the decade and bringing him back safely. Now, at this stage, America only had the Mercury program. The Mercury program at that point only got Alan Shepard in for a brief 15-minute trip into space to 100 miles up, not much higher than the X-15 rocket plane was going, actually. They were competing in spirit rather than reality with the Russians, who'd already got Yuri Gagarin in orbit. Okay, and it was, considered At that time, you have to bear in mind, America was in a bad place. There's the Bay of Pigs invasion had gone wrong. There was Cuba, there's a Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro, the war in Vietnam was brewing up. Rumors and stories about John Kennedy and Bob Kennedy's links with film stars and the mafia, etc., etc. So, you know, it was a kind of a heroic promise to the American people, you know. And the result, of course, of the Apollo program, which was largely the brainchild of the designer Wernher von Braun, is yet another one of the Operation Paperclip war surplus Nazi scientists, who had, you know, whose avowed interest was to put, you know, to build rockets to take people into space and to travel to the moon. You know, even before the Second World War, he was writing, you know, articles and making speeches about that sort of stuff. And Wernher von Braun, it's often forgotten, he was I think he was the designer of the Jupiter-C rocket that finally managed to launch an American satellite, Explorer 1, after lots of failures, one after the other. The American Navy had been trying to launch satellites, and one after the other, these failed. It was at the last minute he took a Jupiter-C rocket and converted it for. It was a clever piece of engineering, but you know, when you look at the size of Sputnik, of Vostok and Sputnik 2 and Lunik and Lunar turns up, and you look at the size of the first American satellites, it was just a token thing. So it was a tremendous. Wernher von Braun was largely responsible for the design of the Saturn I and Saturn V launch vehicles, far larger than anything the Americans had got at the time. And we're told that by 1967, this crew had been chosen to be the first Apollo crew to do the first orbital tests aboard Apollo 1. And you have Ed White, the the first American to spacewalk on Gemini 4, Gus Grissom, the first person to fly the Gemini capsule, Gemini 3, along with John Young, interestingly. And of course, he was also the second American in space, another Redstone suborbital hop, and a rookie, Al Chaffee. And you can see here what they think about the whole thing. Although this is, you know, supposed to be a jokey set-up photo, you know, it does reflect that they're growing, particularly Grissom, is growing dissatisfaction with the Apollo capsule and its underperformance. And he was right to think so, because during a plugs out test shortly before the actual mission, the capsule caught fire due to an electrical spark, I believe, underneath Grissom's seat, and the astronauts sadly died. I mean, whether there are so many different accounts of the thing, whether they suffocated or whether they burned to death. But the main thing, what is known is 5 minutes from inside, they tried to open the hatch and found it couldn't be opened from the inside, not quick enough to make any difference. And then the capsule had to be redesigned completely. This happened in 1967. The following year, of course, in 1968, the first missions, first Earth orbital missions and then lunar orbital missions took place. You know, just a year later, in that time, they redesigned the hatch. They changed the composition of the insulation and the fabrics used inside, all the materials. They changed the partial pressure of the oxygen, I believe. So much was done. You're supposed to believe they achieved that satisfactorily in a really brief time period, you know, in less than a year. Before the fatal plugs out mission in which they died, Grissom hung a lemon outside the hatch of Apollo 1, you know, and you may know that a lemon is generally what Americans call a piece of technology that isn't fit for purpose. So like an Edsel Ford was described, you know, the worst lemon that Ford's ever produced. So he was, you know, very dismissive of the technology, and he really didn't believe it was, and he actually literally told friends he thought it was going to kill him eventually. Be most surprised if the mission was concluded satisfactorily. As a matter of fact, his wife Betty and his son, to this forever, refused to believe that the thing was an accident. I don't think I go this far, but Betty Grissom claimed that he was killed to shut him up because he'd given public press conferences, which he'd said that, if you can't even talk across 3 buildings from the command module, how are you going to talk from orbit or from the moon? He was really quite dismissive. And, when you look at it, where has America been in spaceflight since the end of the Apollo series in 1972? Or if you can't include the suborbital missions. They've only ever been in the so-called orbital region, which is about 500 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The space shuttle, and a wonderful piece of kit, the space shuttle. Let me just remind you, I've got nothing but admiration of the American astronaut corps, particularly the early astronauts of Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the shuttle. Wonderful people, brave, courageous, resourceful, incisive, amazing aviators, most of them, the early ones. It's often forgotten that Neil Armstrong, for example, was a combat veteran from Korea. But that's the furthest they've been. The shuttle, people say, why don't they go to the moon? The shuttle was not built to travel through cislunar space, and it certainly couldn't have landed on the moon. The International Space Station is so low that its orbit gradually degrades because of friction with the upper atmosphere, and it has to be reboosted now and again. Just to put it in perspective, here's the Earth, and to scale, that's where the ISS orbits the Earth, okay? And to the same scale, that's the Earth, and that's the Moon. So you can see since the Apollo missions, we've been nowhere really. Is the failure to return to the moon since 1972, is money the thing? Well, okay, believe it or not, the cost of the entire Apollo program, that includes the cancelled 3 missions, 18, 19, and 20, it includes the Apollo-Soyuz joint program and Skylab. The whole thing only cost $23 billion, which when you compare that with the amount of money that at the time of writing, the Americans spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, 6 trillion plus, and it goes up all the time for various collateral expenditure. And that's, this is immaterial of all the black ops, like the X-37B and, back in the old day, the various other black ops programs run by the CIA in space, and dozens and dozens of spy satellites that he launched from Edwards and Wallops Island and a place like that. And there's enough money just in the Iraq-Afghanistan operation to pay for 260 Apollo programs. So money's not an issue. But the question people say to me when I'm occasionally do talks on the subject, how could something as big as this be kept secret? The idea that of all the people who work for NASA and in the various constructors and things, well, just because you're making threaded nuts and bolts for at Boeing or McDonnell Douglas, it doesn't mean to say what their eventual disposition is going to be, or whether they're at the moon or not. You don't know, do you? When you build a car, or an engine at Halewood, you've got no idea where that engine's going to end up, or how many miles it's going to drive, or even if it ever, gets beyond the factory. The vast majority of people working on the Apollo program had no idea what was really going on. They were just doing their job. I suppose the only people really you'd expect would actually know what was going on would be the people in mission control at Houston. And these are the main controllers. I've met quite a few of them. In Capcom, that's the only guy who's allowed to talk to the astronauts in space, and it's usually another astronaut. For example, on Apollo 11, it was Charlie Duke. At the time of the landing, he was a Capcom. I copy it down, Eagle. That was him. And then you got the surgeon. He looks at his telemetry from the 3 crew members to check that everything's nominal. Booster, during the launch of the rocket, retro, that's he's quite important really to help the commander of the mission decide whether to abort or not. That was important on Apollo 12, which again, that's another large in life mission. That was supposed to believe they had a center engine cut off, or they were struck by lightning, you know, and yet the thing still managed to climb on 4 engines. I remember talking to Alexei Leonov, the Russian astronaut who was the first man to walk in space, and he also took part in the Apollo Joint Soyuz mission. When we're talking, he said, "Oh, you know, it was so lucky. You know, that's one of the reasons that the Soyuz launch rocket and also our giant N1 that we were going to use to go to the moon had multiple engines. Okay, simple reason: if you've got a great cluster of engines, you can lose 2 or 3, even asymmetrically, and the thing will still fly. So if on a Saturn you lost one of the outboard engines, you're dead. That's all there is to it, because it would be, you get asymmetric thrust would just swerve the thing straight over, you know. So that was the retro guy. He was in charge of that, and blah blah blah. The guidance officer in charge of the computers. Again, it's worth remembering that at the time of the Apollo landings, the flight computer aboard the command module had just about the computing power and memory of a washing machine, modern washing machine, and that's almost pretty much the case with the descent computer in the LM as well. It's said that the memory of that is about the same as a modern greetings card. I remember buying Linda a greetings card when you open up and Michael Caine wishing you happy birthday. Well, that EEPROM chip in there is about the same amount of memory as aboard the flight computer on the lunar module. So very, very primitive. And it just, you know, I remember the first PC I bought, as I said before, if you wanted to put in a new bit of software, you had to take out something that already existed. It just wasn't the space on a hard drive. And that was the same with the Apollo computer. If you look at Apollo 13, they had to dump a large amount of program to reprogram for the changing situation aboard the spacecraft. The EECOM, that would be Cy Levergott, the Electrical Environmental Consumables Manager, and all the various controllers. Each one of them is sat in front of 1 or 2 or 3 monitors, and they're looking at their own data. They're not really aware of what anyone else has got. There's very little dialogue during the mission. I mean, as I say, there are exciting bits and bits where not. I mean, if you're the booster controller, you know, you're not got much to do, and so on and so forth. So really and truly, they didn't know what other people do. They didn't really care. You know, they just, as long as they did their own job properly, they monitored telemetry. I suppose that what you're looking for is changes. So the flight surgeon suddenly sees a sudden increase in heartbeat. You know, you might think something serious is going on, or a sudden drop in, or sudden increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you know, output or in their bloodstream, for example, that sort of thing. Okay, and you know, the mission controllers I've spoken to said, really and truly, you know, you wouldn't know. They didn't quite understand my reasons for asking. So I referred to the film Capricorn 1. I said, I suppose you wouldn't really know whether it was coming from the moon or whether it was coming from a spacecraft in orbit around the Earth. So said, no, you know, when obviously there would be a second or so delay, but we wouldn't be aware of that. We're only looking at our systems. There you go. So who else would need to know if the whole thing had been a fake? Who else would need to? Well, the lock-in crew, possibly, the ones who put the astronauts, you know, Gunther Wendt and his mates who bolted the astronauts into their spacecraft, they might need to know. But once they'd left the, if there was one of them in there, there's 1 or 2 left inside at the top of the tower, they could easily remove it. I tend to believe, if the whole thing was a put-up job, I tend to believe the astronauts did go into orbit, and the whole mission was constructed in orbit around the Earth. And people say, how could you keep that? Here was some big secrets that didn't escape. The Manhattan Project that built the first nuclear weapons, the atomic bombs that dropped on Hiroshima and so on. 130,000 people worked for that. And apart from a couple of people who, spies, agents, you know, Klaus Fuchs and so on and so forth, who we're told, for ideological reasons, revealed the secret to the Russians. Nobody else did, and all the people who worked there. Again, if you're an engineer and you're milling out a cylinder, or you're constructing electrical igniters, whatever. You don't know necessarily what it's for, So the secret of the atom bomb was only really kind of mentioned obliquely, I think, by Truman just before the use of the bomb on Hiroshima. So that was never revealed or escaped. At Bletchley Park, the amazing colossus, the nightmare of pulleys and diodes and triodes that helped crack the Enigma code and allowed British cryptologists to stay, or to actually, in many cases, read German signals before the intended recipients. 10,000 people worked at Bletchley Park off and on. And again, the existence of Colossus remained a secret until well into I think even into the 1960s. It was, commercial in confidence or scientific in confidence. It was kept secret, very successfully too. Operation Overlord, D-Day, the invasion of Europe. That was so successfully, despite the fact 250,000 people were involved in construction, material, transport, etc., training, building the camps on the south coast, or that took all the troops that were going to invade Normandy. It was such a successful, it was kept secret so successfully, it's impossible to almost to conceive, but they did. So much so that German High Command, that's particularly, obviously Hitler and Rommel, were convinced right up until the first troops landed, and even after the first troops landed in Normandy, that the actual invasion was going to be across the English Channel from Dover into the Pas-de-Calais region. And there were just, so much so that many of the elite SS armoured divisions were actually nowhere near, if they had been, I think it's quite likely they'd have managed to repel the invasion in short order, but there we are. And last thing, this is what I find most astonishing, is that to all intents and purposes, the Cold War ended in during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the simple fact that they managed to convince the Russians that American technology existed to shoot down, either from space or from the ground, MIRVs, multiple re-entry warheads, from Russian ICBMs, with a close to 100% efficiency. They had beam weapons that could be deployed from satellites or from shuttles in orbit, and that they had sprint missiles that could intercept these things high up in the atmosphere, with minimum effect, and therefore took away the possibility that the Russians could do a surprise nuclear, preemptive nuclear strike on the Americans. That was always the dread during the Cold War. The Russians might suddenly decide not to gradually escalate, with an invasion of West Germany or Berlin, but they were just doing a preemptive strike on the American missile silos and on the chains of command. So the Star Wars initiative, basically the Russians had no alternative to try and keep pace with that technology, and they bankrupted themselves. The Cold War, ended, and that was that. But the whole thing was a lie. It didn't exist at all. 10,000 people were involved in that, and yet that it was only when it was finally after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke up, it was revealed. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. If you've got any emails or questions, do feel free to get in touch with me by email.